Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, colleagues, partners, and friends. I would like to thank all of you for joining us today for this webinar. My name is Viviana Figueroa. I'm Omahuaca from Argentina. I'm member of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. We are very happy to welcome you to this important event, Nexus Dialogues, Indigenous People in Addressing the Global Environmental Agenda. I will be your moderator for the first half of this event, and my sister Jennifer Tauli Corpus, Global Advisor and Advocacy Lead for Niatero, will be moderate the second part. In the first part of the event, the panel members from Indigenous peoples will share their perspectives regarding the needs and opportunities for a strengthening holistic approach and interagency collaboration among the Secretariats of NES, reflecting on ongoing ground learning and best practice for Indigenous peoples. We will be heard from the panel member and have discussion on 3 topics. First, a community-based monitoring and information system of IPLCs as presented in the second edition of the Local Biodiversity Outlook. And second, Indigenous youth engagement in the environmental agenda. And third, the role of Indigenous people in the global environmental agenda. Part 2 of today's event will focus on existing and forward-looking process for engaging Indigenous people in addressing the global environmental agenda. We will hear from the Secretariats of the Convention on Biodiversity, the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Minamata Convention on Mercury, as well as the Global Environmental Facilities. We will take a question at the end of the 2 series of sessions. Please enter your question in the question and answer box located in the control panel on the right side of the screen. As you can see, we have a package of agenda. Therefore, without further delay, it is my pleasure to give the floor to Mrs. Elizabeth Maruna Marena, Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity, to provide opening remarks. Mrs. Marena, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Viviana. Distinguished participants, representatives of the world indigenous peoples, dear colleagues and friends. Given the nature of this event, and as is normally the practice amongst indigenous peoples, allow me to respectively acknowledge the Kanienen, Kehaka, or people of the Flint, the Mohawk people. Greetings from the territory, traditional territory of the Mohawk people, a place that has long served as the site of meetings and exchanges among nations. Let me start by sincerely thanking you all for attending this dialogue. The recognition of human rights to clean, health, and sustainable environment by the Human Rights Council Resolution 48/13 highlights the importance of holistic approaches in addressing the global environmental agenda across the UN system. We come together at this critical time for the natural environment and sustainable development. We are facing a triple planetary crisis of biodiversity loss, climate change, and pollution. These challenges are deeply interconnected with combined impacts which increase at unprecedented levels. Although indigenous peoples and local communities constitute a relatively small proportion of the world's population, I think about 6%, their traditional lands and waters host the most significant remaining reserves of biodiversity, and their contribution to fighting climate change is far greater than we have previously realized. The committed participation of indigenous peoples in advancing the global environmental agenda through your local actions demonstrate the importance of your role in protecting nature despite the threats of environmental degradation imposed on your livelihoods. The latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report published just last month on mitigation of climate change, it presents and confirms that indigenous and local knowledge offers a range of effective approaches for sustainable management of land, soils, biodiversity, and enhanced food security without reliance on modern foreign agricultural technologies. This report further adds to the recent generation of methodical and analytical reports that provide crucial information on the role of indigenous peoples and local communities in contributing to the goals of multilateral environmental agreements. Through recognizing diverse knowledge systems and bringing together traditional and local knowledge with scientific understanding, we can ensure that our collective efforts will be guided by holistic knowledge base in addressing the interrelated environmental crises. Within the UN system, different programs and agencies have recognized the important contribution of indigenous peoples and local communities towards the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals and the global environmental agenda. In 2018, the Convention on Biological Diversity established a working group on Article 8J and related provisions to advise the Conference of the Parties on the implementation of issues related to traditional knowledge and customary sustainable use. Various UN bodies, according to their respective mandates, have equally established mechanisms for participation of indigenous peoples in the environmental agenda. And we will hear from these many representatives from these respective secretariats at this very similar, this current event. The forum's annual session provides an opportunity for us all to hear from indigenous peoples and discuss progress on the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It also offers us with an opportunity to discuss how different multilateral environmental agreement secretariats can strengthen cooperation on issues related to the contribution of indigenous peoples to the environmental agenda. This discussion for collaboration comes at the right time, given the ongoing negotiations under the Convention on Biological Diversity on the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Many challenges remain to be addressed in advancing the development of this framework. Indigenous peoples' values, collective actions, and inputs are an integral part of these collective efforts by the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity towards ensuring that we can all live in harmony with nature and that no one will be left behind. During today's discussion, I encourage you to explore ways and means to enhance our collaboration in engaging indigenous peoples in achieving our common vision of living in harmony with nature. I wish you all a fruitful discussion. Thank you very much, Vivian.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Your commit to addressing the issue facing indigenous people are deeply appreciated. Let's now begin with the panel one, which will discuss the need for a holistic approach to enhance the role of indigenous people in addressing the global environmental agenda. We will hear from indigenous people on opportunities for a strengthening holistic approach and interagency collaboration among MEA secretariats based on their experience and best practice from action on the ground. Each speaker has up to 7 minutes to share their ideas. After the 3 presentations, we will have time for a short question and answers. All attendees are invited to provide questions in the questions box. Our first speaker is Mrs. Georgie Cariño. She is an environmental and development educator and researcher, and her work focuses on community-based monitoring and information system as tool for local governance. She will present on the community-based monitoring and information system of IPLCs as presented in the second edition of the Local Biodiversity Outlooks, which was published in September 2020. Mrs. Cariño, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Viviana. And I'm so happy that today we are discussing in a holistic way the global environmental agenda. What I'll be covering is some aspects of this agenda, issues of national implementation, and of course, community-based monitoring systems. Because currently, all the UN agencies, but also indigenous peoples, are looking at this strategically and looking at a more synergistic approach towards implementation. Now, there is a common architecture in these various conventions and processes. We have the global agreements that are adopted. For example, will be adopted at COP15. Then governments adopt their national strategies and action plans based on these targets and undertake national implementation, monitoring, and reporting. And in the past, for example, in this current strategy, 2011 to 2020, there has been not so strong coverage in national reporting on the contributions of indigenous peoples and local communities. This was shown, for example, in our second edition of Local Biodiversity Outlooks. Therefore, it is a big priority that with our current negotiation as well as the adoption of the post-2020 GBF, there will be strong targets, but also strong monitoring that will happen of these targets. So I want to highlight a problem that was highlighted by the UN Statistics Commission. It says that indigenous issues are an important emerging theme in social statistics, but that data collection and disaggregation concerning indigenous people's unique circumstances at the local level needs to be combined with the development of global comparative data that will show how well indigenous peoples are doing in many regions. So the combination of microdata as well as global trends needs to be addressed. And we are doing this through community-based monitoring and information systems. So the IIFB established a working group on indicators. This actually started with the biodiversity target, 2010 biodiversity target. It continues through this current strategy 2011 to 2020 and will continue after the adoption of the new strategy. So there are already strong resources available from the previous work, and in as much as governments do not want to do duplication of work and are synergizing their national reports, indigenous peoples are also building on past experiences in order to become stronger in our monitoring and indicators. So there is a resource book on indicators relevant for indigenous peoples. This happened together with the UN Permanent Forum and the CBD Secretariat from its early efforts in 26 to 27. Then we have two editions of Local Biodiversity Outlooks. One that got published in Mexico in Cancun, and the second one that complemented the launch of Global Biodiversity Outlooks. And unfortunately, the indicators that have already been adopted by the parties to track traditional knowledge and customary sustainable use have not been used by the parties in the reporting. And so it is important that in this round, the reporting will really address and report on headline indicators that will be followed also by the parties. I want to highlight two indicators already adopted by the SDGs on ending poverty in all its forms. The indicator is on the proportion of the adult population with secure tenure rights to land, with legally recognized documentation, and perceive that these rights are secure. So this is SDG 1.4.2 under the target to end poverty in all its forms. There is another indicator on the average income of small-scale food producers by sex and indigenous status. And this is under the goal to end hunger and to achieve food security and improve nutrition and to promote sustainable agriculture. And within the SDGs are the parity indices, which are supposed to look at this aggregated data to ensure that no one is left behind. We are aware that the CBD has adopted also additional indicators for traditional knowledge. One is the status and trends on indigenous languages, and this is actually currently in the UN decade for indigenous languages. So hopefully UNESCO will be providing reports. Then the status and trends in traditional occupations, and the ILO has just developed a technical paper on traditional occupations in labor statistics. So this is something that can be monitored at a national level, but hopefully strongly at the community level. Then we have the SDG indicators on the status and trends on land use change and secure tenure. And the other one on how well governments are actually integrating IPLCs in their NBSAPs and in other biodiversity plans at all levels. So I'm very happy to say that as reported in local biodiversity outlooks, there is a strong resurgence of indigenous capacity development and local governance. And hopefully this will help in bringing also much stronger monitoring. And we are making this as one of our commitments to the Sharm el-Sheikh Kunming agenda, that we will continue to bring out local biodiversity outlooks. I'd just like to highlight maybe some future actions for us to think about. First is that we need to consolidate existing indigenous and local community initiatives on monitoring. And this can be done through a partnership between UN agencies and indigenous peoples. For example, local biodiversity outlooks is a good collaboration between the CBD Secretariat and the IIFB. There are many region level UN processes. Maybe we can highlight ECLAC in Latin America and the Arctic Council. This can be, again, good areas for collaboration. And hopefully, with the re-establishment of a subsidiary body after COP15 on traditional knowledge, then this will again be another venue for our collaboration. These are some of my reflections on community-based monitoring. I'm handing over back to you, Viviana. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Georgie, for share your views and your experience. All your work on community-based monitoring and information system really is important and also can make contribution to the MES convention. I would like to kindly ask to the audience to put their question on the chat. We have got one question and one comment. I will read it. From Dr. Sanjeta, say how local people using their local source can help in bringing the earth cover green again and make it more cleaner and greener. I think maybe Georgie, you can share also your views. The comment is our ancient system of rain harvesting and our indigenous style of architecture was comparatively much better than why we are using modern technologies which are not supporting to sustainable development, which is also I agree with that, because our traditional technologies were more friendly than the currently. It's important to recover that traditional knowledge to have more sustainable building. Okay, Georgie, you want to address the first question?
Well, very briefly, I didn't hear it completely, but I think local solutions are best addressing local contexts, whether this is architecture or like rainforest harvesting, but also how to cope with, for example, the changing climate, right? There are many innovations, for example, developing in the mangroves, salt-resistant mangroves in order to cope with the existing problems. So I think the creativity and diversity of local solutions will certainly be contributing to addressing the environmental problems we're facing today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Georgie. And also, we don't have other questions. So I would like to ask one question. What are the challenges or how the monitoring community-based monitoring and information system can support or contribute for the achievement of the MES Convention?
Yes. Some of us may be familiar with the Indigenous Navigator. This is it has a national questionnaire and a community questionnaire that is addressing, well, presently the SDGs and the Indigenous Peoples' rights. But we want very much to develop modules that are specifically addressing the MEAs. For example, with the adoption of the post-2020, we will study carefully the targets that are there. Of course, we're already proposing indicators, including headline, complementary, and composite, what do you call? So hopefully in the expert workshop that will happen here, those will be included. So we can then develop community-based questionnaires. So this can be systematically done. And of course, the stories which we will be compiling in local biodiversity outlooks.
Thank you, Georgie. Thank you for sharing your view, because I think it's important that, for example, the communities, when they answer the questionnaires, they can address the different issues that are under the mandate of the different MEAs, no? And also, I know that there is important the indigenous people has this holistic view and contribute to the implementation of this convention. So we are waiting for other panelists who are joining. They have some connection problems. We are hoping that they join soon. Do you want to share with us some other views while we are waiting for other panelists?
I think the experience of the local biodiversity outlooks is something that really can apply to all of the MEAs, because we don't really want to be doing duplication, the same as the national governments. Therefore, this needs to become a more united effort among the indigenous people's organizations and communities. And unfortunately, well, it's the reality that monitoring and consistent reporting actually will require funds and support. Therefore, I think one of the key areas under the action for non-state actors will be really collaborating on how we can bring strong reporting like local biodiversity outlooks. There are already initiatives to actually bring this to the national level, wherein there will be national level local biodiversity outlooks, which can also complement national reporting. And if we start doing that, then we can start covering the other MEAs, for example, issues of pollution, issues of soil, agricultural productivity, etc. So hopefully the parties will realize that this local monitoring is such a strong complement and support for national reporting, and will support this happening at the national level and also our global effort. But this will then require some reliable and predictable funding, so this can be done in a very systematic way. So hopefully, if there are parties who are participating, this will be heard, and also the secretariats of the other conventions, because I know that the CBD Secretariat knows very well that that complementarity has been very useful, and this can apply, of course, to the other conventions as well.
Thank you so much, Georgie, for your views. Are really important because they can help all the work that we have in front. So now, thank you so much, Georgie, and we of course invite you to still sharing your experience on these CBMAs to contribute in the achievement of the objective of the MES Convention. Now, we have the great pleasure, we have our sister Hindu, Homaham Ibrahim. She is with us. She is the Vice President of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and expert in issues related to Indigenous people adaptation to climate change. And he will deliver his presentation on the role of the Indigenous people in the global environmental agenda. Mrs. Indu, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Viviana, and it's very nice being with all of you here. And thanks to Georgie, I hear also what you said. It's really great to know you are all there. And sorry to be late. As you know, I'm in the Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues in New York, and then things are really running over all the places. So allow me to just remind all of us that this year is very particular for all of us and for Indigenous peoples too. Environmentally, we are going to have the 3 COPs at the same years. Hopefully, the CBD also will end up by giving us a date. But next week will be the UNCCD, who is the Desertification Conventions, one of the Rio conventions that is happening, the COP15 in Abidjan. And many Indigenous peoples also will be attending this COP because we are going to talk about the land and resources. And of course, we are going to have the climate COP in Egypt by the end of the years, and where the focus will be also important on the role of Indigenous peoples, and especially how we can deliver and concrete outcome at the local level and access to finance. And then the CBD, where we still negotiating, and then one of the SABSTA and SBI will be in Nairobi, Kenya. So for Indigenous peoples, the global environment issue, it is not a matter of COP. It is not the number of the meetings that we are holding, but it is a matter of life and survival of the indigenous peoples, because we are living in the connection with the land, territories, and resources. We are depending from those environment. So we also protecting them by our unique traditional knowledge through our 7 socio-cultural regions. And we really hear last week at the Permanent Forum how much the issue of environment is very important for indigenous peoples. We can't talk about the indigenous people's rights or indigenous people's self-determinations or indigenous people free, prior, and informed consent without linking it with the environment. So the global participation of indigenous peoples must be the one priorities of the conventions that are discussing about the different issues on environment. So indigenous peoples being in the tables of the negotiation of the UNCCD, UNCBD, and UNFCCC, it's really very crucial, not only as stakeholders, just as major group, but being as actors, as decision makers, because we are the ones who are implementing on the ground the decisions that are taken at the international level. Even if our government are not translating that at the local policies, for us it is naturally a duty and also way of living to translate that and implement them in the communities. For example, so when you go around the ocean countries, all the Pacific islands, indigenous peoples are the ones who are protecting the coral reef, who are practicing the traditional way of fishing, who do not do the overfishing, and who know how to restore those ecosystems. At the same time, when you go to Congo Basin, Amazon, or Indonesia rainforest, it is the same, the indigenous peoples that know the rivers that flowing the water that can protect the rainforest, and then the different animals that are living there that they can help to keep the balance. And at the same time, when you go around my regions, and especially around my community, my people is still moving from one place to another one to find what in pastures, but to help the ecosystem, this fragile ecosystem, to get regenerate in a natural way. So we are acting with our solutions, combining the traditional knowledge, sometimes with the science knowledge, with the technology, to help our peoples to protect the world ecosystem. But how the international agreements like the different conventions can help indigenous peoples to boost the work that we are doing. So it is very important to see firstly in the upcoming CBD, SAPSTA, and SBI discussions, how the role of indigenous peoples to be defined to get the equal fitting and equal access to the decision making, and to have the direct access funding to protect the biodiversity, to have the right best approach, and the free, prior, and informed consent to be included. We know that the Article 8G, 10C, all are working for indigenous peoples, but we wanted to see the way forward during the implementations. So sitting in the tables, having access to the finance, and then translating all what we are doing to the right best approach to do not harm us, to do not steal our land or destroy our biodiversity. It is much needed at the international level in the CBD. So when we turn to the next COP that is coming next week of the UNCCD, land right is very important for indigenous peoples. Of course, we wanted to see the land tenure, who can respect the tenure facility of indigenous peoples, and who can recognize that our land is the most fertile, but to do not grab our land to give it to some companies or to give it to some agricultures industrialized, but to help the indigenous peoples to better protect those land and produce in those land. So land restorations in the UNCCD must also include the right best approach, the free, prior, and informed consent, and avoid the land grabbing of indigenous peoples or displacing indigenous communities. So help indigenous communities to implement the right projects by giving them the access to the funding, for example, through the great green wall, or through the renewable energy that is happening around all those regions. And when we come to the climate conventions, we are very grateful that our voices are recognized. We have the facilitative working group of the local communities, Indigenous Peoples platform, and we have the platform who is working. And we also have like the commitment on 1.7 billions. But however, this is not enough, because commitment is not a deliverable action on the ground. So we wanted to see how those funding can be channelized directly to Indigenous peoples to respond to the name of the direct access funding. And we wanted to have those mechanisms of Indigenous peoples who can work on it. And in this manner, we cannot choose one ecosystem. We must respond to all the ecosystem. We cannot protect the rainforest if we do not protect the savannas. And we cannot protect the savannas if we do not protect the Sahel. We cannot protect the Sahel region if we do not protect also the desert. And all that is response to the oceans, to the Arctic. So we need to put these interconnections and deliver the direct access funding. And by the COP27 in Egypt, at least we know the role of Indigenous peoples on putting the project on the ground and accessing the funding become a reality. So the 3 Rio Convention are already interconnected in our lands. So we wanted to have it connected at the international level, and we are ready to work with you through all our different mechanisms, through those conventions, and also from the permanent forums as expert of the UN, where we are helping the 7 sociocultural regions to deliver their voices. UN is very important for us, but we are more important for the planet. So include us, put us in the driver's seat, and we can show you the way. I'm so happy to be with all of you in this panel, and really wish to you that we can have a good deliberation and we can be following up in the next coming weeks, days, and months. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Sister Indu, for sharing us all the work that you and Ma and some brothers and sisters are doing in different convention and its meetings, and also for mentioning the importance of Indigenous people are actors in decision making related to biodiversity. We have questions. Matthew Ramadan Assam is saying that in Assam, the biodiversity, ecosystem, and environment is destroyed by the government itself. The Oil Indian Limited and Oil and Natural Gas Corporation are always established drilling stations to extract oil from indigenous land without prior and informed consent of indigenous people. In this situation, what shall we do? How can United Nations or World Indigenous Organization can help us?
Right, thank you for the question. And this is really very important for all of us to notify that the free, prior, informed consent, it is not a survey. It is not an information. It is a process that must be set up for Indigenous peoples. And the free, prior, informed consent, it is a right for Indigenous peoples. So for the government or company that are using the indigenous land to extract oil or any other extraction that they are doing in our lands, they must stop that. It is not possible and it is not acceptable to continuously doing that. So from the UN, we have the mechanism through the UN Special Rapporteurs on the Right of Indigenous Peoples. So this person can visit the country, but of course the government need to invite the special rapporteurs to go there in order to visit and then report back what is harm in the indigenous peoples. However, if the country didn't invite the special rapporteurs, you still as indigenous peoples can send him the report of what is happening in the land, and then he can use the report and then highlight that during the discussions with the different government and different companies in order to denunciate that. And then the second thing is also through the Geneva human rights mechanism. Indigenous peoples can report, they can present a special report where the country is going to present his own report in order to say what is happening in the land and ask the commission to come up with a special resolutions. And don't forget also, we just to get a special rapporteurs on climate change and human rights. So this new nomination can be very helpful to conduct any study on what is happening on the land of the indigenous peoples that are harmed. And I know also, I hear from the Permanent Forum, some of the government and also some of the companies that wanted to set up or extract the land of indigenous peoples, and then they went to the court, and even with the court that giving them the reason, it will have been very hard for the government to implement. So we need that to unite it all our effort and denunciate what is happening, because it's not acceptable in this manner. They say they have to protect the nature and at the same time they harm the indigenous land. So they have to stop that, and we are the one who are taking the lead on asking them, requesting them, and put them also in outside in the media to tell them that they are doing the contradictory. Don't forget that government need our voices to get elected. So what they are touching in our land, we must also touch in our own election. We have to vote for the right peoples, and if it is not the right peoples are voting, we have to put them outside for the next election, because we cannot continuously take them in the seat.
Thank you so much, Sister Hindu, for your very powerful message. I think there is a lot of issues that we need to work on together. No? With this, thanks so much to the panelists, or Sister Georgie and Hindu. For now, we will turn to the panel 2, or Sister Jennifer Tauli Corpus from Niatero, who will be moderating. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Viviana. Dear participants, it is a pleasure to join you all today. My name is Jennifer Tauli Corpus, and I am a Kankanae Igorot from the Mountain Province of the Philippines. Today, I am delighted to moderate the discussions with the UN agencies on opportunities for IPLCs to engage in the many different processes that are intended to serve the global environmental agenda. I will be asking each panel member a question, and at the end of the segment, time permitting, we will take questions. Please enter your questions in the question and answer box located in the control panel on the right side of the screen. So this is panel 2, and our first guest is from the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. I would like to welcome Mr. Kapah Conde Choque, Program Management Officer of the Secretariat of the CBD. Kapah, the question is, the CBD established the Working Group on Article 8J and related provisions in 1998. Since then, the working group has provided an important forum for indigenous peoples and local communities, and with parties, IPLCs have developed global policy guidance for the implementation of CBD provisions on traditional knowledge and customary sustainable use. Could you please describe the CBD's engagement with indigenous peoples and how that engagement has promoted coherence and cooperation among the various MEAs? Over to you, Kapah.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for the question. Yes, thank you for the question. Well, in 1998, the CBD COP4 decided to establish a specific ad hoc body known as the Working Group on Article 8J and related provision to address the application on traditional knowledge as in Article 8J, customary sustainable use, Article 10C, exchange and repatriation of traditional knowledge, Article 17, Paragraph 2, and scientific cooperation, including indigenous and traditional technologies, Article 18.4. From 2000 to 2019, the Working Group on Article 8J has met 11 times, and it became an important forum for the CBD parties, IPLCs, and stakeholders to discuss traditional knowledge issues. It's in its conclusion, the working group has the mandate to provide the Conference of Parties advice relating Article 8J and the related provisions. It also provide advice to the Conference of Parties on measures to strengthen cooperation at the international level among indigenous peoples, local communities, embodying traditional knowledge, and also to review the process of the implementation of the tasks in the program of work on Article 8J. The first program of work on Article 8J invite the working group to develop guidance implementation of the convention in regards to the needs of indigenous people and local communities. A series of voluntary guidelines were prepared. The first guideline is the AQUICON, voluntary guidelines to conduct an environmental and social impact assessment regarding development proposed projects that take place or which are likely to impact sacred sites of indigenous people or lands and waters traditionally occupied by indigenous people. The following voluntary guidelines are on traditional knowledge in specific issues such as the Tari Wari Code of Ethics, which guides the activities and interactions with indigenous peoples for the development of local, international, and regional codes of ethics to ensure the respect for cultural and intellectual heritage. The second guidelines on traditional laws is the most cultural voluntary guidelines to support the development mechanism, legislation, or other appropriate initiative to ensure free prior from consent, prior and informed consent, or approval or involvement, depending on the national circumstances of indigenous people and local communities for accessing their knowledge, including safeguards such as fair and equitable benefit sharing arising from the utilization of that knowledge, and reporting and preventing unlawful appropriation of traditional knowledge. Finally, it's the Rasoligi Asaki voluntary guidelines to aim to facilitate repatriation of traditional knowledge. In regards to customized sustainable use, COP12 adopted the Plan of Action on Customized Sustainable Use as a means to promote the implementation of Article 10C at all levels. The objectives of the plan is to promote implementation by setting practical guidelines to promote traditional knowledge-based management of biodiversity. The plan includes a set of guidelines for traditional knowledge holders, users, and policymakers, as well as a series of measures to support the effective conservation and sustainable use of traditional knowledge. The CBD COP15 is tasked to adopt the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and along with this decision in COP15, it will also consider the process to develop a new program of work on Article 8J and institutional arrangement for indigenous peoples. These discussions on the new program of work would include possible forms of cooperation and future dialogues to bring together parties and a wide gender of voices inside of this complex issue of environmental stewardship and indigenous people contribution in addressing the environmental agenda. This discussion will involve information sharing, consideration of option of the new program of work, and types of local actions that might take place. We invite the Permanent Forum members and as well MEAs to join this discussion. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you very much, Kapak. Indeed, I think that is a very impressive body of work from the CBD. And now that the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is envisioned to apply to all biodiversity-related conventions, I hope that the guidelines you have mentioned would also be accepted as applicable to the other conventions. So thank you, Kapak. Now we move on to the Secretariat of the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. And we are very honored to have the lead scientist with us today, Mr. Baron Orr. The question for you is, the UNCCD links the environment and development to sustainable land management. For Indigenous peoples, land is fundamental for their livelihoods and well-being. At the same time, IPLCs are critical actors in combating land degradation and desertification, as our sister Hindu presented in the first panel. Could you tell us how the UNCCD facilitates further strengthening of the contributions of Indigenous peoples and their work on land degradation? Over to you, Mr. Orr.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jennifer, and greetings to all from Bonn, Germany, and to everybody that's involved with the UN Forum on Indigenous Issues. I want to thank the organizers for the invitation to speak alongside these distinguished panel members. And as mentioned, I'm here representing the UNCCD Secretariat, and the UNCCD is the Rio Convention focused on land. As documented in the just released second edition of the Global Land Outlook, the health and continued survival of many species on Earth, including our own, is threatened by the way land resources, soil, water, and biodiversity are mismanaged and misused today. More than 70% of terrestrial ice-free ecosystems have been transformed from their natural state, and governments report that 1 in 5 of those hectares are no longer productive. $44 trillion US, roughly half of the world's annual economic output, is being put at risk by the ongoing degradation. Together with climate change, land degradation is undermining the livelihood of local communities, displacing populations from traditional lands, and causing rapid and widespread loss of biodiversity. The time is now for investing in the communities and peoples who, through their care for land, can help turn this around. The Global Land Outlook shows this would be an excellent investment. The returns from regenerative restoration economy, are estimated to be worth 125 to 140 trillion US dollars annually. I realize this is a very large number, up to 1.5 times the global GDP. A number so large, it tends to take the focus away from who we should be investing in. I'm referring to the 608 million farming families around the world, the local communities and indigenous peoples who are so well positioned to manage restoration efforts. It is these people who have the most direct interest in successful restoration and their immediate livelihoods and their future of their children. They often have deep spiritual and cultural ties to their land, which is an integral part of their cultural and social identity. They come with intimate knowledge from thousands of years of observation, experience, and management of the land. And they have the institutions for the collective management of common pool resources, as well as approaches to local engagement that are necessary for success. Empowering these land stewards means addressing the bottlenecks limiting success, which is what the policymakers of the UNCCD are doing right now, as Hindu indicated earlier. This includes encouraging the review and alignment of all policies and all incentives at the national level so that environmental, economic, and social activities work together, making land an accelerator of all 17 SDGs. It means shifting more focus to where decisions about land are actually made and making integrated and inclusive land use planning the norm so that municipal, agricultural, and conservation planners are all in the same room and local communities and indigenous peoples have full representation everywhere and every time land use decisions are made. Safeguarding land tenure by embedding the principles of the voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of tenure into the framework for land degradation neutrality, which is SDG target 15.3, is another element being discussed in Abidjan. Promoting the use of the right mix of tools and approaches to operationalize integrated and inclusive land use planning so that planners can ensure we are doing the right things in the right places at the right scale with the right people. Reinforcing all of this is more and more is on the agenda of the 15th UNCCD Conference of the Parties, which begins next week in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire. Reinforcing all of this can help bring the future we want to all of us. Bringing forward the future we want requires acting now. As Lavina Lightbrown of the Haida Nation, an archipelago off of Western Canada, once said, "We do not inherit this land from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Baron. And I really enjoyed listening to you because I have to confess I don't know much about the UNCCD, but it was great to hear about the Global Land Outlook and how it's connected also to the VGGT and the other ongoing processes, including the SDGs. So good luck with COP15 next week. I was going to say later this month, but it's already next week. So thank you very much. Now we turn to the Secretariat of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and we're very pleased to welcome Ms. Coco Warner, Manager of the Adaptation Division. And the question for you, Coco, is the UNFCCC's COP26 adopted the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform's second work plan. Can you please brief us on potential opportunities for collaboration between the platform and MEA secretariats with regard to the engagement of Indigenous peoples and capacity building in addressing climate change policies and actions? The floor is yours, Coco.
Thank you so much, and hi everyone. I love the question, and it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Also, hello to all of you, valued and esteemed colleagues, Hindu especially. It's wonderful to see you. Good luck as co-chair of the Permanent Forum last week and this coming week. Clearly CBD and UNCCD, you're moving so much important work in the world, and it's just important and good to be here with all of you. And so much has been said about the nexus between society, nature, and some of the defining challenges and opportunities in our time. And in some ways, I have the sense it's really a humbling opportunity to work with Indigenous peoples and local communities under the Climate Change Convention. But in some ways, one of my big learnings is that Indigenous peoples, with their wisdom, their practices, their values, are at the nexus of all of this. And what we're seeing in the climate change conversation, and again, Hindu and all of our networks are bringing so much insight that the countries and parties who are part of our process, in some ways, are asking, how do we find out more? How do we learn about the practices? How do we engage ethically and respectfully? And I think the desire is growing to have that meaningful engagement. And so in some ways I come to you hoping to learn. So this is what I have to say. For just coming from the narrower or just the area of climate change, we know from knowledge practices, the IPBES, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that stewarding nature provides one of humanity's best chances to achieve our aspirations. And those aspirations have to do with well-being and stability and a peaceful life together. And they also have to do with taking care of this beautiful planet. And as part of that, the Paris Agreement absolutely requires all hands on deck. We learned recently and very soberingly from the both the second and the third volumes of the IPCC that science estimates that we have until about mid-decade, that's just 2 years away, 3 years away, to half emissions in order to keep average pre-industrial global temperature, or to keep average temperatures above pre-industrial levels at 1.5 degrees. And there are very sobering consequences for people, for biomes, for all of us if we pass those thresholds. We need everyone, and more than any time that I know of, we need Indigenous voices and expertise at the table. And so with all of that in mind, Some of you know about the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform under the UNFCCC. Hindu is one of the co-chairs of the committee or the constituted body that was established in 2018 to really carry out the work under that platform. And as you said, Jennifer, we've just started our second work plan, and that's stretching ahead of us. And we have so much work to do. We would be so delighted to continue our good collaboration, obviously with CBD and UNCCD, but also a very open invitation to all of you, if you're interested, to get involved in a number of ways. So let me tell you 3 areas where we'd really invite your active participation. And these 3 things, I'm not gonna tell you all of the details of our work plan, but I will, after I stop talking, I'll put a reference to that in the link or in the chat box so that you can go there and take a look. We have lots of activities coming up where you can actually help us out with your knowledge and teach us what we need to know. So there are 3 areas. 1, what are the practices that Indigenous peoples and local communities are doing that are relevant to biodiversity and restoring land and ecosystems? And of course, that are relevant to helping in our process, climate change, to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions and to help society kind of navigate in a stable way. That's adaptation. What are the practices and what are the results? We hear a lot about Indigenous food systems, the way that many Indigenous peoples take care of soil, the way that many Indigenous peoples are able to steward biodiversity and maintain a balance. There is such a huge desire to learn about those practices and those results. And also, as I mentioned, there's a need to build the capacity of governments and other stakeholders to know how to engage appropriately. And just an acknowledgement that that hasn't always been done very well. So we have a lot to learn. The second is to understand in that dialogue and meaningful engagement with Indigenous experts of these practices, what could governments learn from and replicate? I know that the values and especially the deeper spiritual meanings are not replicable and sometimes not appropriate to share, but can some of those practices be incorporated into what governments are trying to do in their nationally determined contributions and national adaptation plans? Are there things that could be scaled up? Are there things that could help with this big mission that we have? And then the third is focusing on networks of people. What could we do as a secretariat to help you diffuse those knowledges and practices and results, always in an appropriate ethical way, but really to help spread the word and to help governments and many societal actors engage more profoundly with Indigenous expertise, values, and those practices. So with that said, maybe just something really specific. In the next couple of weeks, we have our own climate negotiations, our mid-year climate negotiations. We call them the SBs or subsidiary bodies. Those are coming up. We have a committee meeting. That's the facilitative working group. And again, I'll put all of this information in the chat. So everything that I just said, I'm actually inviting you to get involved. You're welcome to attend the meeting in person. The meetings will be webcast if you just want to listen in, like you listen into the radio. And moving forward, as I mentioned, for all of these activities, we truly want to engage with you. And so again, I'll put those in the chat. It's our great hope that by working together and really by elevating Indigenous leadership and expertise, that we'll have a better shot at our very aspirational goals to steward this planet and to take care of society. Thank you so much. I'll stop now.
Thank you so much, Coco. Indeed, the crisis is urgent, as the different science policy panels have pointed out, and Indigenous peoples may hold part of the solution. So thank you very much for very specifically identifying the opportunities. And when Indigenous peoples act on the ground, we don't identify if this action is going to be addressing biological diversity. This action is going to be addressing climate change. In fact, it's a very holistic view. So thanks very much. Now we move on to the Secretariat of the Minamata Convention on Mercury. And we have the pleasure of having Ms. Manuela Pessoa de Miranda, Program Management Officer from the Secretariat. So my question for you, Manuela, last month, parties to the Minamata Convention on Mercury met in the second segment of the Minamata COP4 on Mercury in Bali, where parties discussed a framework to evaluate the convention's effectiveness. The meeting addressed artisanal and small-scale mining, which produces a large source of mercury emissions in Indigenous peoples' territories. So please tell us how Indigenous peoples can be involved in the next steps of the decisions taken at COP4. The floor is yours, Manuela.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Hello, everyone. It's a big pleasure to be here. The Minamata Convention on Mercury is not one of the three Rio conventions. The convention is only 4 years old or young. So I look at the three of you, the three panelists from the CBD, UNCCD, and UNFCCC. And it's so inspiring because this is really what we aim to achieve, is to have this level of engagement with Indigenous peoples. So Jennifer, before I answer your question straight, let me just make a little bit of advertising for the Minamata Convention, because I can almost bet that some of you have not really heard of it yet. The objective of the convention is to protect human health and the environment from mercury, which comes from man-made sources. Mercury is a naturally occurring element, but it's mostly from human-made sources that the problem arises. It's an extremely toxic chemical. It's a very serious pollutant for both human health and the environment. Just to give you an idea, in humans, it's known where it's best studied. It causes birth defects. It causes neurological and reproductive problems. It seriously affects children and mothers in childbearing age. But the problems are not only limited to humans. In all animals studied, the effects are also seen. So we've been talking about the triple planetary crisis, and that's where the Minamata Convention on Mercury is trying to contribute to. Is not just fighting mercury as a chemical pollutant that affects human health, but looking at it in an integrated manner that both it's not only mercury is the pollution is exacerbated by climate change, but it also affects and in a small way, but it will also affect climate change. Same thing with biodiversity. It causes loss of biodiversity, and the less biodiversity there is, the worse the problem of mercury. Land degradation is a clear connection with the use of mercury in small-scale gold mining, for example, that causes vast degradation of land, many of those in indigenous lands. So human activities have contributed to an increase of 500 times the natural levels of mercury circulating in the environment. It's high time that the countries came together to combat and eliminate mercury throughout its life cycle. So I hope you're interested enough now to ask yourself, so where is this mercury? Where is all this mercury? In fact, it's in several industrial processes and products. It ranges from cosmetic products, things that you put on your skin, to light bulbs in your home, and even in your teeth. Those fillings, which I have a couple, that I still widely use, mostly in developing countries, they contain dental amalgam, which is basically an amalgam made of mercury. The biggest source of mercury, though, comes from small scale and artisanal gold mining, which is most of the gold that's done informally uses mercury still nowadays. And it contributes to 40% of the total global mercury emissions and releases to the environment. So mercury is everywhere. It's in the water, it's in the air, but it's where it circulates in the water and it turns into another chemical. It's called methylmercury, that it accumulates and causes most harm to wildlife and humans. It accumulates in fish, and the higher you go in the food chain, in the food web, the more it accumulates. So people who rely on fish and other types of seafood or even aquatic mammals for their diet are seriously impacted. But it's so this immediately brings us to indigenous peoples, who are disproportionately impacted, not just the health, but the environment, their lands, their livelihoods. Most of the gold mining, the small scale gold mining, happens on indigenous lands. The traditional food, most indigenous peoples live along river basins or along the coast and rely heavily on fish, both freshwater and marine fish. And some communities rely also on aquatic mammals. It affects food security. The diminished fish stocks not only change the cultural habits, but it also causes food insecurity. So as I mentioned, also land degradation has a close link to small scale gold mining and to the loss of livelihoods. Last but certainly not least, there is also an erosion of cultural and spiritual values of indigenous peoples. So this is the dark side of mercury. However, indigenous peoples have a huge role to play, not only because you're disproportionately affected, but also because of your role, like Hindu mentioned, through your traditional knowledge, through your stewardship of much of the natural richness, and the importance of having indigenous people sitting at the decision table and taking decisions on equal footing, decisions that affect both at local, national, and global levels. So now going more to your question, Jennifer, we had our Conference of the Parties, or COP, last month in March in Indonesia. And the good news is that it was the first time that indigenous peoples received funding dedicated to their participation at the COP. It was the largest representation, therefore, of indigenous peoples at the Minamata COP, in spite of the COVID restrictions. And the result of this is that indigenous peoples featured in a few of the COP decisions. So just to give you a few highlights, countries asked, the COP called upon countries to invite indigenous peoples to the development and implementation of national action plans to address and eliminate the use of mercury and small-scale gold mining. This is a huge step forward. This still has to be developed. We need to develop guidelines and see how countries can meaningfully engage indigenous peoples, and also to raise awareness of indigenous peoples of the problem and how they can participate with their traditional knowledge, with community-based monitoring to that process. Another decision also called for the Secretariats, requested the Secretariats to gather the needs and priorities of indigenous peoples. This is also a huge step forward because we didn't have a mandate, a Secretariat, to work explicitly on indigenous peoples as a group of stakeholders, and this gives us that mandate, which is a huge step for us in the Secretariat. And last but not least, it's another very, very important aspect, is that indigenous peoples were invited to participate in the monitoring efforts to contribute to evaluating the effectiveness of the convention. This is a long-term process, but the monitoring will be extremely important. And as Jorge Carino mentioned before, it will be exactly that community-based monitoring and indicators that are relevant to indigenous peoples that will make up this contribution, which will be so relevant, especially in terms of artisanal and small-scale gold mining. So as a next step, we are soon issuing call for nominations of experts in various areas, including experts representing indigenous organizations. So I hope that many of you will join this process and we'll start making the Minamata Convention look more like the other three, our big sisters, the Rio conventions, in terms of indigenous engagement. We expect that there will be indigenous participation in an open-ended scientific group that will look at holistic ways to contribute to the evaluating the effectiveness of the convention. And there will be many other ways in which indigenous peoples can and should hopefully engage the Minamata work. Before I conclude my remarks, I would like to thank all of you for these minutes here, but I look forward to continue working with you. And special thanks for the CBD organizers who allowed us, the little Minamata Convention, to join the big ones, our big sisters. And I look forward to answering any questions in the chat or later on. If you wish, please do get my email and contact me. It would be a pleasure. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manuela, and thank you for walking us through what the Minamata Convention has been doing in relation to Indigenous peoples and for identifying future opportunities. So thank you. And now we move to the last speaker for this panel from the Global Environment Facility. So we have with us Ms. Chizuru Aoki, Lead Environmental Specialist at the GEF. So I apologize if I mispronounced your name, but the question for you is that 29 countries have jointly pledged more than 5 billion in the current 8th replenishment to the GEF, providing a major boost to international efforts to protect biodiversity and curb threats from climate change, plastics, and toxic chemicals through collaborative action this decade. Could you please brief us on the GEF's approach and commitment to work closely with Indigenous peoples and the different programs that exist to support IPLCs, such as the SGP or the Small Grants Program? Over to you, Ms. Aoki.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and you pronounced my name perfectly. And I also would like to thank Elizabeth Mrema, the Executive Secretary, and CBD colleagues for organizing this important session with Indigenous peoples and other MEAs. I apologize for my voice. We're having a COVID crisis in my household, and because of that, my voice is gone. I come from the GEF, which I'm sure some of you might know or might not know. We serve as the financial mechanism for the conventions that are presented here today. So UNFCCC, the CBD, the Minamata Convention, as well as CCD, and we are also the financial mechanism for the Stockholm Convention. So I'm asked to talk a little bit about what we're going to be supporting in terms of IPs, and we're actually very happy that with the strong support pledge for the GEF 8 period, which will cover the period of July 1, 2022 to June 30th of 2026. We're like the Olympics, we operate on the 4-year cycle. So donors actually put on the table $5.25 billion, which is about 30% more compared to the GEF 7 period. So we think of this as a very strong voice of confidence in the GEF to deliver on the global environmental benefits, as well as the need to address the crisis on the global scale that is unfolding right now. And for us, the enhanced support is also great news towards really helping the countries address major agreements that are anticipated to be reached. And obviously the big one that everyone's looking at is the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework for CBD. But quite a number of upcoming milestones are actually there for CCC as well as CCD and Minamata Convention in terms of compliance, as well as coming to some kind of a milestone for addressing certain things that have been agreed by parties for the convention. For the GEF, the Indigenous peoples and local communities, IPLCs, we consider them to be critical partners to meet our goal of enhancing the global environment. We need to, we want to, and we are very much committed to work with the Indigenous people, and because we think they're crucial, as well as the partners, to enhance our ability to reach the global targets and goals across the conventions that we serve. And I think this is a point that Elizabeth, Executive Secretary, highlighted very well. And there's also a lot of scientific evidence emerging as to the role and possibility of the indigenous peoples to be able to address some of the global challenges that we're facing. So, and from the climate change angle, I think Coco mentioned this, indigenous people is also the ones that are expected to be, I would say, the most significantly impacted as well as most threatened by the impacts of climate change and the global development. So they also have a lot to lose. And, you know, from that perspective, we want to make sure they're part of the solution as well as the discourse as a whole. So our approach from the GEF, our approach and commitments to work with IPLCs are multifaceted. And we're also front and center of the GEF 8 programming directions. We do have a pretty long track record of supporting IPLCs by channeling resources to and also through the IPLCs for various projects and programs. And what are these entry points to enable their engagement? They are actually spelled out in what we call the programming directions, which have been agreed in the replenishment process that just concluded. One key example from the ongoing GEF 7 period is a very interesting program called the Inclusive Conservation Initiative, ICI, which is a $25 million grant that is fully dedicated to support IPLC organizations in their efforts and stewardship of lands, waters, and natural resources that are really considered to be key for protecting the global biodiversity, but they also serve as cargo stocks and sinks. So this project is something that we were able to get approved by Council in 2019, and it's already under implementation by Conservation International and IUCN. And what's really interesting of this $25 million program is full 80% of the grants will go directly to IPLC organizations on the ground. In addition to the on-ground sub-projects that are to be directly executed by IPLCs, we're really making sure that they have an increased opportunity and representation within the conventions. I already heard from the convention colleagues that they are already quite a bit of efforts ongoing to enable their voices to be heard as well as their participation to be supported. So that's very good. So I think we can move ahead with doing this in tandem and partnership with the conventions. We also are supporting South-South exchanges, capacity building, and I do have to mention that strong decisions made by the CBD on the inclusion of IPLCs and creating opportunities for funds directed by IPs were really important for the GEF to be able to step in and say, we can support this kind of initiative. So this also goes to show that how the conventions and the GEF can work together to identify opportunities and support mechanisms for IPs. There's quite a number of other entry points, if I may say so, for the IPs to come in the GEF 8 strategy. Let me just mention that for the small grants program, which was Jennifer, you included in the question, it continues to be one of the main entry points, I would say, for the IPLCs to have their initiative supported in alignment with the overall GEF programming directions. In the GEF 8 period, the SGP will channel about 153 million as a floor, and we're also trying to introduce some innovative changes, such as an opportunity for additional agencies beyond UNDP to implement the small grants program, and a challenge program to support innovative ideas based on a call for proposals. So anybody should be able to submit an interesting proposal, and there's an opportunity for them to be supported. Another example that I wanted to highlight was on the Minamata Convention and the mercury pollution, but Manuela did an excellent job of highlighting that. So let me just say, in terms of the support for artisanal small-scale gold mining, where we know it's actually still ongoing in over 80 countries, it's impacting 15 million workers, mostly in rural areas, as well as a lot of IP countries, IP areas. We are supporting we have been supporting a development of good practice guides of indigenous peoples in mining, and we're trying to look into issues requiring special attention to the interests and rights of indigenous peoples, also based on the free, prior, and informed consent principle, which is something that the Hindu highlighted earlier as a very important element. So I think we're running out of time. Let me just indicate that in the GEF 8 programming directions, we do have a lot of interesting and additional opportunities for and with IPLCs. We have, for instance, identified ecosystem restoration and integrated program, Amazon, Congo, and critical forest biomes, the Blue and Green Island integrated programs. We will also have opportunities under the JEF's adaptation-related funds, the Least Developed Countries Fund, and the Special Climate Change Fund, because now in the strategy for those funds related to climate adaptation, we are including the whole of society approach for practical entry points for IPLCs that Coco mentioned earlier from a climate adaptation angle can also be supported. So with that, we're keen to further enhance our partnership to work with IPLCs and facilitate more funds to be made available for in JEF 8 for the community groups as well as indigenous peoples. We consider IPs to be the stewards of the global environment, and we're keen to really further enhance our engagement. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Chizuru, and I hope you and your family get well. My family had COVID as well last year, and it's great that with the vaccinations, it's no longer a death sentence. No, it doesn't require hospitalization. So please get well and stay safe. All right, we have one question in the chat. I know that we're running out of time, but since it's just one question, I would like to ask the panelists, and I'll modify it a bit to include some of my reflections. But one of the demands from Indigenous peoples nowadays is direct participation, as well as direct access to finance, so as direct as possible. And having come from the Geneva meetings, it was great that in all of the sessions of the CBD, Indigenous peoples were able to make statements in our capacity as Indigenous people. So is that how could that be facilitated as well in the other conventions? And how could direct finance for Indigenous peoples be supported? So again, coming from Geneva, this is something that the countries unfortunately did not express strong support for. So, and for obvious reasons, it's regarded as competition, no? If you give finances directly to Indigenous peoples. But could you share any reflections you may have on direct participation and direct access to funds? Thank you. And maybe I'll go in the order of my screen, or anyone who would like to share their thoughts, please jump in. Yes, Chizuru, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this question. I'm gonna try to answer the question on the funding side. As I try to mention, I think there are increasing opportunities for IPs to have direct support, and the inclusive conservation initiative that I talked about. We're also keen to sort of continue with an effort of this nature where 80% of the resources right now are targeted to be channeled through the IPs as executing partners. So there are opportunities that are already there, and we also want to make sure that there is a very clear engagement for them to be included in the design of the program as well as steering the conversation. So, for instance, the JEF Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group is part of the steering committee of this particular initiative to help design and give some level of oversight. So that kind of engagement as well as the access to resources, I think, are starting to emerge more prominently in the JEF, and we're committed to do this further. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And yes, go ahead, please, Manuela.
Thanks, Jennifer. This is quite an important question. The Minamata has a program called the Specific International Program that provides funding it's through countries, but it's direct funding coming from the convention, and it's very important because it's for a lot of grassroots projects. Just to give you an idea, just last year we had 9 projects approved. The scale is much smaller than the JEF projects, of course. The Minamata is not a funding agency, nor is an implementation agency, but this is a mechanism where we've seen a very strong grassroots involvement, including, for example, in Antigua and Barbuda. They have the indigenous peoples and local communities have achieved a lot of success in fighting mercury. And now we have projects in Burundi, Gabon, India, Rwanda, Senegal, several of the countries that have serious problems with artisanal and small-scale gold mining, which is this program, the CIP, is not limited to artisanal and small-scale gold mining. But of course, because it's such an important issue, many of these projects are focused on this. So there is this opportunity, and indigenous communities who would like to tap into that are very welcome to contact me, and I can put you in contact with my colleagues who are responsible for the CIP.
Thank you so much, and I'm very sorry to do this, but if we could limit to 1 minute our statements for the 3 remaining panelists. Baron, please go ahead.
Sure, I'll hit on the participation side. In the UNCCD, Indigenous peoples and local communities are very influential in the civil society side of the UNCCD, which actually led to a decision on land tenure in the previous COP, which is a very big milestone. And for a convention on land to open that door is really, really powerful. And that's it really extended in this next COP. We'll see where it goes, but there's a lot on the table that could move that agenda forward, and it's being driven by Indigenous peoples and local communities. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and I'm very glad to hear that. I'll move to Coco next.
Yeah, thanks very much. I wanted to, in some ways, just kind of advertise. This isn't directly to the question. The finance question has been, you did such a nice job, Chizuru. But in order to participate in the UNFCCC process, for those of you who are going to be observers, that means people who aren't part of a government delegation, make sure that your organization is accredited. And if any of you need information about how to do that, just write to me. I'll also drop my email into the chat box, but just reach out. It takes a little bit of time, so be very patient, but it's not a very hard process. So go through the front door, get accredited. That means that for every single negotiation session, such as our COP, your delegation or your organization will get a few badges so that people from your organization can participate. And that is a critical first step to make sure that Indigenous expertise and the experiences of local communities are being heard. You have to be there. So that's the first thing. There is an Indigenous Peoples organizations constituency. And for those of you who identify yourselves perhaps more as local communities, you can get accredited. And then it's also possible for you to kind of self-organize a small interest group. We have such examples with faith-based organizations, groups with disabilities, etc. So even though there's not a constituency dedicated to local communities, I just want to let you know you're very welcome. And so first get accredited. Well, maybe first just write me an email and I'll let you know all the details, get accredited. And then if you are self-identifying as a local community, the next step is to form a little group. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Coco. I will take you up on that. Niatero is quite a new organization and we need to be accredited. Thank you. And over to you, Kapak.
Thank you. Yeah, very quickly. On the accreditation, the CBD has several Indigenous peoples and local communities accredited. This is very important. They accredited as IPLC, and this is thanks to a recommendation to the Permanent Forum that eventually went to Working Group AJ and COP. Another key point from our experience is the voluntary fund. IPLCs, they have the IFB, they organize themselves, and they're able to get funded, but the Secretariat also do the job and also have to establish a voluntary fund for them to apply. Yeah, I think I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kapak. And thank you very much to all of the panelists. I'm very sorry we ran a little bit over time, but now we're ready to close the event. And I would like to call on Jessica Vega, who is from the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus, to share with us some closing reflections before we close out this event. Jessica, you have the floor. If you can turn on your video, that would be great.
Sorry. Hello. I'm sorry. I think that I can put my video now, but I wanted to share with you some words. My name is Jessica. I am part of the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus, and then I think that all the perspective here is really important, because I am agree when the panelists they said about the really importance to try to bring the opportunities and indigenous people, like the one first actors and the special actors for the try to be more strong this agenda for the environment. But I wanna do something that special people, indigenous youth, because the care for the future is the new generation already have a lot of problems in the community level, but the problem need to take action for the take resolution. And then I think that all the information here is really important to try to share in the communities level, and also to try to involve our youth people in these new mechanisms, in these opportunities, and try to bring solution together. This is the one thing that happening in the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus. Try to combine the ideas of the 7 regions for to try to put new resolution, and to try to making a little innovation, not only when the technologies, also when the knowledge indigenous people, to try to combine the new knowledge like the technology, but also the knowledge for the elders. This is the one thing that in the global indigenous happening, but also to try to engagement youth people from the community levels in the 7 regions. For example, in Latin America, my network in Latin America working in this year for to try to collect more information with CBD, and in the January to have the one training for the try to open spaces, because these mechanisms have big process, but not only not all the younger people know about this, and then it's necessary to share the information with them and bring more effective actions in the national and regional level for the try to open this opportunity in the global context. This is the one thing that I want to share with you, and also is to note for all the global people that the part of the conservation and the biodiversity is management for indigenous people, but the new generation needed not a little more, needed not how can the involve in this process for because the already take action in the fear line, but also needed contribute a little more for ensure more empower the process for the climate policies, because also needed take the one strategic position in different platforms. And then it's so grateful listen the how the mechanisms like the private sector, like the organization, the organisms, like the all the people try to working and the open space like COP, like the new agendas in the global context. And then this is the one thing that for the indigenous youth, this is the one crucial role for to try to engagement in this agenda, and then take the good resolution and the sharing the all the knowledge for the contribute or the have the more good mother earth, because this mother earth is for all the people, not only for indigenous people, is for the all the people in this mother earth, and they need take action together for have the one healthy mother earth in the future generation, and to try to say take action and the good time. And this time is the more important action. The present, because if it no happen and nothing, no had future for the new generation. This is the one thing that for conclusion for my side, and say the great thank you all for sharing this information, for to try to invite other people for to try to join us this process.
Thank you so much for those inspiring words, Jessica. And indeed, it's important that we engage the Indigenous youth in all of our efforts. They are our future partners. So once again, thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to my co-moderator, Viviana, and thank you to all the attendees. It is through our collaboration that we advance in all of these processes. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good luck, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Stay safe. Bye-bye.